Blessed good morning to all of you. This morning in our sermon, I'm going to be doing a sermon and a topic that the Apostle Paul never preached on. Peter never talked about this subject. And I don't know if you know, Alexander Campbell or Barton W. Stone never talked about this subject we're going to discuss this morning. Or as Charles spoke about Wednesday night, Foy Wallace never spoke about this subject. In fact, they really were not able to talk about what we're going to discuss this morning. Today we're going to talk about idolatry. And you might say, well, wait a second, Brother Brent. Paul did talk about idolatry, and so did Peter, and I'm sure those other preachers did as well. Well, that is true. But today we're going to talk about what I call the idolatry of technology. The idolatry of technology, when technology trumps spirituality. You know, that's a thing that things come around in our culture, in our day and time, that present challenges to us as Christians that were not around in biblical times. And yet principles of things from the Bible can definitely help us to see what might be that challenge, or might be something we need to consider, or maybe even to change. So when I look at the subject of idolatry, as we talk about idolatry today, it's a challenge. It's difficult to preach on. I really see that the Bible talks about two forms or two different types of idolatry. First and foremost, let me ask you this. When we think of idolatry, what do we think of most often? Well, most often we think about that type of idolatry that we see in the Bible. I'm going to just term this biblical idolatry. It's all over the pages of the Bible. And we think of these man-made statues that are placed in these man-made temples. And this is a type of idolatry that's very visible. It's very clear. These people are bowing down. They're offering things to these fake gods. And we see it all over the Bible. Now, does this type of idolatry exist in our modern day world? And the answer to that is yes, absolutely. In fact, we could find temples and idols and polytheism right here in the state of Florida. You wouldn't have to go very far to find maybe a Hindu temple or a Buddhist temple or something along those lines. If you were to travel eastward to Asia, almost every country you would go to, if you were to do the tourist thing, one of the tourist things you would do is go visit some type of idol temple to see how the people in that country worship and their religion. But I would say, for the most part, this is not really something that we have to preach a whole lot on, because for us today, it's not a very big temptation. We're not trying to find some temple somewhere that we can offer some type of offering or bow down and devote ourselves to some statue with the name of a particular god. But when we think about idolatry, let me ask you this. Do we ever think about this? Do we ever think about the technology we have in our world today? And I would imagine most of us would say, no, I don't really think about that. And that's why, as a preacher in today's world, it's difficult to talk about idolatry. Because what becomes our idols today is what? Well, there's a very big difference between what is a challenge, what is a temptation, what is idolatrous today in a modern sense. Not that this isn't in the Bible, But what is a temptation for us today, one of the big differences is that our idols, for the most part, are morally neutral, right? For example, if you watch any type of documentary on football, often it starts something like this. In the state of Texas, football is a religion. People pray to the football gods, and they offer them the highest praise when their team comes to victory. Something along those lines, right? And there are people who admit that football is their religion. It can definitely be rooting for your team idolatry. But does that mean if you have a favorite team and you root for that team, or you go to a football game, that you're involving yourself in idolatry? I don't think so. But there's definitely a line that you can cross. And that line, when you cross that line, it becomes more than a sport. You become more than a fan. It becomes definitely, it can become an idol for you. So you might be thinking, well, Brother Brent, you're going to draw that line for us today, and you're going to make me feel like an idolater, and, well, I'm not going to do that this morning. In fact, I don't think it would be any use for me to try to draw some line to say, here's the line. I'm not sure we get a clear picture of where that line is. In fact, if I was to do that, well, I don't know what that would be taken by you. In fact, more profitable is that I would ask you, like any sermon, that we want to listen and we want to open our hearts and we want to look inwardly, not just outwardly. We want to look to ourselves and not just to someone else. And we want to be honest with ourselves. I think it'd be better in the things that we talk about today that you draw a line for yourself. And to be honest, to see if this is something that you need to think about and possibly need to change. I'm going to talk a little bit about what makes idolatry idolatry to give us some idea, and then we're going to relate that into technology that is so prevalent today. In fact, kind of like we talked about on Wednesday night, in biblical times, when the church started, it came into what is known as a Greco-Roman world. A world that was influenced greatly by Greek culture called Hellenism. And I told you that it doesn't matter where you lived in that time, in that day and age, even in Judea of the land of Canaan or in Jerusalem, you were influenced and you had to accept some of that Hellenistic culture to some degree. Well, it's the same when it comes to iPhones or Android phones or tablets or laptops or any of that technology. Some here don't want to be part of it, but you've had to accept some of it to some degree because that's just the world we live in. And so a lesson like this is, I think, very needed and very profitable. And so our gods today are not right or wrong. They're morally neutral. They're not wrong in themselves. And they don't become a god simply because you use technology or have technology, but it's what? The way that you use it, how you use it, what you're using it for that often can determine what that is for you. So even though having a cell phone or a tablet or laptop isn't a sinful thing, in fact, there's a lot of good that comes out of that technology. But that doesn't mean that this technology doesn't and can't cause spiritual hazards. Let's go over to the book of Colossians chapter 3. Colossians chapter 3. And I'm going to read from verse 5 as a little consideration of what we're talking about today. So in Colossians chapter 3, verse 5, Paul writes these words: "Therefore, consider the members of your earthly body as dead to immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and greed, which amounts to idolatry." Now, we're well aware of this passage, and we often notice that last sin that he talks about, greed, he doesn't just say, "and greed," but he says, "which amounts to idolatry." Now, I've always wondered, is greed the only thing that's idolatrous in there? Can these other things of sexual immorality and purity and passion and evil desire, can't those also become idolatry? And I would say yes. Now, to be honest, in this verse, in the Greek and its grammar, that word idolatry is very much grammatically connected with that word greed and not the other words. And so that's why so many make that point. But by principle, if greed can be idolatry, so can any sin. And what that shows us, brother and sister in Christ, is that idolatry can be, an idol can be something, not just a man-made statue in a man-made temple, but it can actually be sin. It can be a worship of an inanimate object. It can be the worship and dedication of a person or people, or even of self. And so idolatry is not just in what I call the biblical sense. There's definitely idolatry in our world today, but the challenge is it's hard to know when we cross that line. And as we talked about in an earlier lesson, we really shouldn't think about sin as simply a line in the sand trying to get as close to that line but not crossing it. No, the idea of a Christian is to stay away from that line, far away as we can. And so I started thinking about what are some of the things that are involved with idolatry, that make it a religion, that make it into more than just something. And I started coming up with idolatry, there's definitely a certain trust, a certain belief that this God is necessary, that this God can help you. It can do that. There's a devotion to it. But this word reliance is what I really want to stand out. That in idolatry there's a reliance, there's this belief, there's this feeling that I need this God in my life to help me to survive, to help me in this situation. I need this God to help me in this situation. There's a reliance on these, if you will, a feeling that you can't live without it. I had a study one time with a friend of one of our members. And he was from the Catholic Church, and he came to me and he said, I want to talk about baptism. And he was very troubled because as his friend, his Christian friend, talked to him, he started to see, in the Bible, baptism is an immersion into water for the forgiveness of sins. And he wasn't being taught that in the Catholic Church. So we sat down and we looked at what baptism is and its purpose and all of that. That it's an immersion, and not a sprinkling or pouring. And he was so convinced. He said, I want to be baptized. And I just felt that there's something missing a little bit here. So I asked him, I said, what about after you're being baptized? What happens after your baptism? He said, well, I'm going to go back to the Catholic Church. I said, well, we're going to have to talk about that. And in that discussion, he brought up the Catholicism of the saints, the praying through the saints. And I tried to point out to him that's not in the New Testament. It was not part of the original church. And at some point, he finally said to me, I'm sorry, but I need the saints. I need those in my life. They help me. The fact that I can pray through them, I need that. Well, you could see he wasn't making the connections that's not biblical. It's not what God says you need. And really putting that ahead of Scripture. So, as you can see, that didn't go well. But it's that idea. I have reliance. I need that in my life. And, what about technology? What about our phone? And just to be safe as I was preaching on this, I took my phone today and I locked in my office because I was really afraid it would go off in the middle of this sermon, and then, boy, would I be embarrassed. But you know what? Sometimes technology can make us a slave. A slave to technology. Let's go over to Romans chapter 6 as was our scripture reading this morning. Romans chapter 6, and we're going to begin in verse 16. And there the Apostle Paul writes, do you not know that when you present yourselves to someone as slaves for obedience, you are slaves of the one whom you obey, either of sin resulting in death or of obedience resulting in righteousness. Now, I understand Paul is talking about becoming and being a slave to sin. I understand that. He's not talking about technology and iPhones and all that, but there's the principle, isn't it? To become a slave to something other than God. To have reliance and even obedience to the need of that and the use of that, it's not good. To become a slave of sin is not good. To become a slave of anything else other than our devotion and reliance on God is something we need to be careful of. Drop down to verse 18, where then Paul says, for such men are slaves, not of the Lord Christ, but of their own appetites. Can we live without our technology? Can we turn it off completely? I'm not just talking about silencing it. I think there's some people that, and again, I know there's nothing wrong with having your phone on and you work and all of that. But is there sometimes where you just can't do that? It just drives you crazy? There was a time where, let me start it this way. We talk about disciplining our children, right? And we have that whole thing about spanking and how that's necessary and it's the last step, but when you have to take that, right? But when your kids get to be teenagers, that just kind of goes out the door. It kind of doesn't work, right? But there's a couple things you can do that work really well. In fact, if you haven't seen your teenage children for a while, try this. Turn off the Wi-Fi. You'll see your children very quickly. They will emerge from their bedrooms. Now, of course, they're going to be very upset. They're going to be angry. They're going to be asking, what's going on with the Wi-Fi? And when you tell them, oh, I turned it off. Boy, you want a teenager to get in line, just turn off the Wi-Fi or take his phone. It works. And that might be an indication that sometimes there's a little and reliance on technology. I'm a very, very visual person. Let me kind of visualize this for you. What about family time, right? Still today, I think a lot of families understand that having family time is important. And, sometimes, like it was in the old days, dinner time was that crucial time where, we turn off the TV, we sit around the table, and we talk, right? And maybe you even go around and every member of the family, including the kids, get to tell what they did that day and what's going on. And you can just see this family, right? And they're bonding and they're laughing and they're smiling. And it's this great time. Well, a lot of times, family time today looks like this. Right? Now, maybe this is okay. This is together time, right? And you can see either, dad is sharing something with his daughter and they're all smiling and having time together. And sometimes that's good. Time together, fellowship together. Not necessarily you have to always be talking, but my point is this the way family time always is? And if so, maybe it's something we need to think about. Maybe that's a problem. As parents, one of the great things was like, after a busy week of school and homework and Wednesday night service and all that, Saturday, the kids don't have any sports. There's nothing. You get to sleep in, right? Mom and dad are like, oh man, we get to sleep in Saturday morning. Saturday morning comes in, you're sleeping in, and what happens? The kids wake up early, barge into your room, jump on the bed, get in between you and your spouse, and at first you're like, oh, there goes my sleep. But sometimes that's like some of the best family time, right? You're hugging on them, and they just want to be with mom and dad first thing in the morning. It's neat. I love those times, right? But maybe today it looks something like this. Right? Now again, this is still together time, and dad's got his arm around his daughter, and they're enjoying their time together. Nothing wrong with that. But again, if this is what family time always looks like, then that might be a problem. What about friend time? Getting together with your friends, having a good time. Well, this might be what it looks like today. I remember being at Angel Stadium at a baseball game, and it was time for the fan cam, not the kissing cam, the fan cam, right? And it's going around, and most of the time it gets on some fans, and they see that on TV, and they're going, yeah, right? Well, there was actually, the fan cam went on these 4 girls, and they were in the stands, and they were doing this. And they didn't even look up. They didn't even know they were in the fan cam. Now you're like, well, they're not even talking to. Well, you don't understand. This girl is talking to this girl that's in through text messaging. That's how that works today, right? Now again, that's very common. Nothing wrong with that. But is that always the way it's going to be with the friends, right? It's always the way we have fellowship and spend time together. All right, one more. Date night. How many still have date night? And if you don't, we're going to do another sermon. Date night, right? What does date night look like? Well, sometimes it's nice to just, get a babysitter for the kids. Mom and dad maybe get dressed up a little bit, have a nice dinner, a nice night out, and yet might look like this, right? Now again, I understand. You're on date night, you need to have that phone on in case something happens with the kids. I totally understand that. And there's times where, there's an important phone call you have to take. But again, if this is what every date night starts to look like, your time together, I'm preaching to myself. Tamara's gonna tell me, like, yeah, what about you? Yeah, I know. But something to think about, right? Where do you draw that line? Well, you draw that line. You do it for yourself. When technology trumps spirituality, that was something that was really interesting as a preacher, as you start to see people go from Bibles, actual physical Bibles, and now they're on their phone during church, right? And so there's, well, I use my device because it has my Bible on it. Okay, I get that. I don't have any problem with that, right? It's very common today, technology. I've got a tablet that has a Bible program that when I'm in the audience, I kind of use that a lot, right? Well, let me ask you this. Is it an undistracted use? And what happens as you're reading and you're following along when you get a text or you get a Facebook alert or someone tries to call you? I know the temptation. Well, I'll just quickly look at the text, right? I'll just look at what someone's posting, right? Just take a few seconds. You can turn those things off, right? You can turn off Wi-Fi. You can turn off data. You can turn off notifications. But a lot of times we're thinking, oh, that's just too much trouble. Or maybe we're thinking of, well, it might be something important. We're here to worship. And is this how we honor God? Let's look at Psalm 96, verse 9. Just going to look at verse 9 as the psalmist starts to talk about worship. And this is what he writes. Worship the Lord in holy attire. Tremble before him, all the earth. What a great passage. As he is thinking about worshiping the Lord, what does he say? He doesn't say, great, we're going to go sit in a pew. We're going to show up. No, he brings up what? Where we are internally. We're trembling. This is an opportunity for us to open up our heart, to give him the praise of our lips, the concentration and devotion of our hearts. And sometimes I think we kind of just do it so often. It becomes a habit. Very little effort, very little concentration. And maybe using our phone as our Bible is part of that distraction. Worship is something, I guess I would put it this way, you got to get into. I'm not talking about outwardly jumping around. I'm talking about in here. This is your time to be with your brethren. And in a sense, we're together, we're collectively doing it. But in another sense, I'm pouring my heart out to God. I want to put the world out. Physically, mentally, spiritually. And maybe I just need to turn my phone off. Or turn off data. Turn off Wi-Fi. It's God, you're the most important thing. This is my time to show you my love and reverence and devotion. Do we put enough emphasis on preparing and understanding what we're doing here? Maybe we don't understand or remember how great He's the God that created the world. He deserves our complete devotion and attention. Let's take a look at some other passages. I'm going to have to close this up. We're running out of time here. Ephesians 5:18 through 20. Look at what he says. And do not get drunk with wine, for that is dissipation, but be filled with the Spirit. How am I going to fill myself with the Spirit? Well, Paul says one of the ways we do that, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody with your heart to the Lord, always giving thanks for all things in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ to God, even the Father. Fill yourself with the Spirit. What? By singing. Singing with a thanksgiving heart. Or are we worried about what our voice sounds like to our neighbor? I think we need to be more concerned about what our heart sounds like to God. Are we completely devoted and dedicated as we worship Him? In Ephesians 5:15 through 16, therefore be careful how you walk, not as unwise men, but as wise, making the most of your time, because the days are evil. The way we use our technology, is it making the best use of time? Or is it wasting time sometimes? We haven't even talked about what you use your technology for. But we're out of time. We'll reserve that for another lesson, and there's a couple more, or another lesson that I want to do somewhere down the line. But, idolatry is tough. It's tough to convince people you've got a problem. Something's become an idol. But I hope my words here, I hope these passages today will challenge you. Am I too dedicated, too reliant, spending too much time with my technology that's affecting my relationship with God, my spouse, my children, others? We want complete devotion to the Lord, and it all starts with serving Him with a sincere heart. And maybe there's one here this morning that needs to become a child of God. Maybe you need help to return into a right, dedicated, reliant relationship. And we're willing to help you do that. If you let that be known, come to the front, meet me as together we stand and as we sing.